And now they're in the ice, so they're just going to move with the ice moving. So it's kind of interesting to see that. I believe they deployed 12 this year. Is that right, Jeff? Okay. They usually do about 12 a year.
Yeah. Oh, I see. There is the date up there.
Yeah. So yeah. So if you go to this website, you can pick any year and look at them. Okay, and then finally, with these ocean currents, I was mentioning Maureen Wang does the climate modeling, and it's not just how much ice cover there's going to be in the future. She can do other parameters. One of those is the direction of the ocean currents. So for these 3 mooring sites, she modeled what the ocean currents are going to be, and that's these black lines. And then for those years, they plotted on top what the actual direction of the currents are. So she's actually getting a pretty good handle on how the currents are going to be. So we can predict what the ice is going to be like. We can predict what the currents are going to be like. So we can hypothesize what's going to happen in the future with marine mammals in the Arctic. So here we go. I apologize for this being blurry. The current situation is the Chukchi Sea has a really highly productive benthic biomass. So that basically means there's a lot of food on the bottom. And this is coming from lots of nutrients coming up from the Bering Sea, the Anadyr current on the Russian side, and also, what's the other current? I'm blanking. Not that one. DCC? Is it DCC? There was another one.
ACC, Anadyr, Bering Sea.
Bering Sea. So they're coming up, the nutrients are coming up from there, and then there's a lot of local production going on from falling down from the ice and whatnot. So there are 2 scenarios that the oceanographers have come up with. In both scenarios, the ice is retreating early because that is what's going to be happening in the future. The first scenario has the ice retreating early and really strong winds happening. So the strong winds, the water column is going to be completely mixed up. Everything on the bottom is going to go up into the top. So there's going to be a whole lot less in the bottom, less benthic. Because it's being stirred up, that when the CTD went down and you had that peak in the salinity and all that green chlorophyll matter, that's not going to happen. So that was that layer there. Not going to happen in this scenario. You are going to have a lot of nutrients in the water column, a lot of sun warming it up, so there's a lot of production up there. You're going to have blooms that are going to go from spring all the way through the fall. So the ecosystem in the Chukchi Sea in this scenario is going to switch from being benthic to pelagic up in the water column.
What's pelagic?
Pelagic is the water column, benthic is the bottom.
Okay.
This is already happening in the southern Bering Sea. So how is this going to affect the marine mammals? So it's really going to affect marine mammals that are very specialized in what they eat. If there's an animal that can eat a lot of different kinds of things, they'll probably be all right. So bowheads can eat things on the bottom. They can eat stuff in the water column. They're not really going to be that affected by this. Where they're going to be affected is because the ice is retreating early, they're not going to have to follow those leads in the ice to get through. They may not be stuck on the coast. They might be able to travel offshore more, which means that they might not be passing by where hunters can hunt them. So there could be quite an impact there. Beluga whales are also not very specialized. They can eat everything, and I just discovered this spring, worms and octopus up through fish. So if it goes from benthic, where there's worms and octopus and they're eating those, to something pelagic where there's fish, they're going to do just fine. They aren't going to be so much affected as far as subsistence hunting goes because they have to go into Kasegliak Lagoon to molt, so they're still going to be coming close. So that's probably not going to be a big issue there. Gray whales normally suck things out of the mud, and you always think of them as something that eats on the bottom, but they are known to, especially off of Washington and British Columbia, eat things in the water column. So they're also very generalized in their feeding, and they'll be okay. Bearded seals are the most generic feeders of marine mammals in the Arctic, and so they will do just fine. Their only issue for them is they like hauling out on the ice, and there won't be so much ice around, but we see them all the time just kind of bobbing around. It'll take a little bit more energy, but maybe there'll be more nutrients nutritious fish in the water column, so maybe they'll be okay. That's just something we don't know yet. Walrus, however, are not going to do very well. They're super specialized in what they eat. They eat bivalves that live on the bottom. So they're going to have to move further offshore. The problem with that is they really can only feed to about 200 meters deep. So the further they move offshore, the less they're going to have that opportunity to actually reach the bottom. And they really do like hauling out on ice. And if the ice is really far out, you're going to have what's happening now where they just haul out on land. And that is a problem because there's so many of them hauling out on land. The young get crushed. It's not a great scene for them. And they're already starting to find that the walrus are moving out of the Chukchi and going towards the Russian coast ahead of the ice coming in, just probably for that reason. So that's scenario 1, strong winds. Scenario 2 is weak winds. So the ice is going way early, but it's weak winds. It's not blowing out, it's melting. So you start getting basically fresh water on top of salt water, and it makes that salinity gradient really strong. But the problem with that is that because there's a gradient, what's falling from the ice down is not getting there, as well as the weak winds are not having a lot of nutrients coming up from the Bering Sea. So it's kind of a twofold lack of productivity on the bottom. So again, the benthic is going away. You do have a bloom on the surface, but because there's not much there to begin with, once it's used up, it's gone. So the pelagic is not great. What is not known is whether there's going to be strong production or not underneath that layer where it became really green. So there's kind of two parts to this one. That's the subsurface blooms. Basically, again, feeders that are very generic in what they eat are going to do better than ones that are specialized. If there's really great blooms underneath there, then all the same thing as scenario 1 is going to kind of apply here. All these animals are going to do just fine. They're just going to switch what they're eating. If it doesn't do well, then they're going to have to leave and go probably further offshore. So that's the two possibilities for those animals. Again, if the bowheads go further offshore, they're not available to hunters to hunt. Again, in this scenario, walrus are just going to lose. There's not going to be much on the bottom for them to eat. They can't move really far offshore because they can't dive down deep enough to eat. And they're probably just going to be less of them in the Chukchi Sea and more of them over in Russia.
So how come you just picked those whales? I was thinking that there's more whales than those up here, aren't there?
Those are the main ones that are there all year round. Those are the Arctic species.
The main one. Okay.
Yeah. Which other ones were you thinking of?
I was just thinking that there
Sei whales are really desirable whales for
sei whales.
Yeah.
Sei whales don't come up this far. So the fin whales are going to come up in the Arctic before the sei whales do. They're more of a
Oh, really?
yeah, you've seen sei whales up there?
They see them on the aerial surveys.
Oh yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, well I don't know anything about that. Sorry.
that's all.
The problem with sei whales for us is they are very hard to tell apart from fin whales.
They're pretty small.
Well, just their sounds. We haven't quite figured that out yet, so
Okay.
we haven't been looking at them. So final thoughts. So I showed you 2 years of what our data shows. This is from another project off of Barrow where we were just looking at bowheads, and this is data that Stephanie went through for a long time. And this is just showing a 5-year time series of how the bowheads come and go up there. But I want to kind of conclude with this slide, and this is critters living on the bottom off of Valdez, Alaska. So every year they did a transect and counted how many critters were along on the bottom. And so this is a 35-year time series, and the point to bring home here is if you looked at any 5-year segment in here, you'd have a completely different idea of what was happening at that point in time. There was a major earthquake that happened around here, so this is sort of everything recovering. The Arctic is changing really quickly. There are very big impacts from anthropogenic sources and other just climate change, and it's going to be important for us to keep these time series going to see what happens in the future and to be able to compare it to the past. So with that, I just want to acknowledge the people that have funded us and supported us.